James Mitchell stood perfectly still in the scorching afternoon sun, his red uniform soaked with sweat beneath the heavy fabric. The tourists gathered around him, taking photos and making jokes, completely unaware that he had been standing in the same position for over 2 hours without moving a muscle. His feet were on fire, his back ached, and a bead of sweat was slowly making its way down his forehead, threatening to reach his eye. The 24-year-old guard had dreamed of this job since he was a child. Growing up in a small town outside London, he had visited the palace with his grandmother when he was 8 years old. The sight of the guards in their magnificent uniforms, standing with such dignity and honor, had captured his imagination completely. He had spent years training, studying, and preparing for this moment. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of the job. As James fought to maintain his composure, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Another guard, David Thompson, was positioned about 50 feet away at the main entrance. David had been on duty for the same amount of time, and James could see the subtle signs of struggle that only another guard would recognize. David's left leg was trembling almost imperceptibly, a sure sign that he was fighting against muscle cramps. The crowd around James grew larger as a tour group approached. The guide was explaining the history of the guard uniforms, pointing at James as if he were a statue in a museum. Children pressed their faces close to his, trying to make him laugh or move. Adults made silly faces and waved their hands in front of his eyes. Through it all, James remained motionless, his training keeping him focused despite the discomfort. But then disaster struck. A young child, no more than 5 years old, suddenly broke away from his parents and ran directly into James's legs. The unexpected impact caused James to wobble slightly, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might fall over. His carefully maintained posture was broken, and he could feel the eyes of hundreds of tourists on him. Some began to laugh, others pointed and whispered among themselves. James felt his face burning with embarrassment beneath his bearskin hat. This was exactly the kind of mistake that could lead to disciplinary action. Guards were expected to maintain their position no matter what happened around them. He had heard stories of guards who had been reprimanded for far less serious breaches of protocol. His mind raced with worry about what his commanding officers would say if they found out about this incident. From his position at the main entrance, David had witnessed the entire incident. He could see the tension in James's shoulders, the slight shift in his stance that indicated distress. David knew exactly what James was going through because he had experienced similar moments during his own 3 years of service. Every guard had stories of close calls, moments when their composure was tested to the breaking point. As the crowd around James began to disperse, David made a subtle decision that would change both of their days. Without breaking his own rigid posture or drawing attention to himself, David began to execute a series of tiny, almost invisible movements. To any observer, it would look like nothing more than the natural micro-adjustments that any human body makes during long periods of stillness. But James, trained to notice such details, immediately understood what was happening. David was creating a small distraction. By shifting his weight in a barely noticeable way, he was drawing the attention of nearby tourists who were always watching for any sign of movement from the guards. It was a masterful technique that required perfect timing and control. The tourists near David began to focus on him instead, speculating about whether he was about to move or speak. This gave James the precious few seconds he needed to regain his composure and reset his position. The temporary relief from being the center of attention allowed him to refocus his mind and strengthen his resolve. He silently repositioned his feet, straightened his shoulders, and returned to the perfect stance that was expected of him. The incident had lasted less than 30 seconds, but in that time, something important had happened. James had experienced his first real taste of the unspoken brotherhood that existed among the royal guards. David didn't know James personally. They had never spoken beyond the brief formal acknowledgments required during shift changes. But in that moment of need, David had instinctively offered help in the only way possible within the constraints of their duty. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself thinking about David's gesture. The job could be incredibly isolating. Guards were not supposed to talk to tourists, show emotion, or acknowledge the people around them. They were expected to be living statues, perfect representations of British tradition and discipline. But beneath those red uniforms were real people with real struggles, and sometimes those struggles required the support of someone who understood. The sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard. James's shift would end in another hour, but he felt stronger now than he had earlier. Every time his resolve began to waver, he remembered David's subtle act of solidarity. It reminded him that he was not alone in this challenging but honored ceremonial. When a new group of tourists approached, James was ready. He stood with renewed confidence, his posture perfect, his focus clear. The incident with the child seemed like a distant memory now. He had learned something valuable about the job that no training manual could have taught him. Sometimes the most important support came not from commanding officers or formal recognition, but from a fellow guard who understood exactly what you were going through. As his shift finally ended and James prepared to march away from his post, he caught David's eye for just a fraction of a second. No words were spoken, no gestures made, but something passed between them. It was the beginning of an understanding that would grow into something much more significant in the days and weeks to come. 3 days after the incident with the child, James Mitchell found himself assigned to the same patrol route as David Thompson for the first time. The early morning mist hung low over the palace grounds as they walked their designated path, maintaining the required distance between them while performing their security rounds. The formal silence between guards during active duty meant they couldn't speak, but James felt a strange comfort in David's presence nearby. David had been thinking about the younger guard since that afternoon in the courtyard. Something about James's struggle had reminded David of his own early days in the service. He remembered the overwhelming pressure, the constant fear of making a mistake, and the loneliness that came with the job. Most guards learned to cope through trial and error, some succeeding and others requesting transfers to less demanding positions. But David had noticed something in James's recovery that suggested he had the right temperament for the work. As they completed their morning patrol, both guards returned to the barracks to prepare for their afternoon ceremonial duties. The changing of the guard was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and both men would be part of the elaborate ceremony that drew thousands of tourists every day. James sat quietly at his locker, methodically checking his uniform and equipment. His hands moved with practiced precision, but David could see the underlying tension in his movements. The barracks were unusually quiet that morning. Several of the senior guards were attending a training seminar, leaving only the newer recruits and a few veterans like David. This created an atmosphere that was less formal than usual, though still bound by the strict protocols that governed all aspects of guard behavior. David found himself in the unique position of being the most experienced guard present, a responsibility he took seriously. As James struggled with a stubborn button on his tunic, his frustration became obvious. The button had been giving him trouble for days, and he had been too embarrassed to ask for help with what seemed like such a simple problem. David observed this for several minutes before making a decision that went against his usual preference for maintaining distance from newer guards. Without saying a word, David approached James's locker and gestured toward the problematic button. James looked up, surprised by the offer of assistance. In the world of royal guards, asking for help was often seen as a sign of weakness, and offering help could be interpreted as implying that someone was incompetent. But David's expression was neutral and professional, making it clear that this was simply one soldier helping another with a practical problem. David's experienced fingers quickly identified the issue with the button. A small piece of thread was caught in the mechanism, preventing it from closing properly. With a tiny pair of scissors from his own kit, he carefully removed the obstruction and tested the button several times to ensure it would work reliably. The entire interaction took less than 2 minutes and was conducted in complete silence, but its significance was much greater than the simple repair job. For James, this second act of support from David represented something he hadn't expected to find in his new career. The Guard service had a reputation for being impersonal and demanding, focused entirely on duty and tradition. Personal relationships were discouraged, and individual struggles were expected to be handled privately. But David's quiet assistance suggested that beneath the formal structure, there were still opportunities for human connection and mutual support. Later that afternoon, during the changing of the guard ceremony, James performed flawlessly. His movements were crisp and precise, his timing perfect, and his bearing exemplary. The repaired button held throughout the entire ceremony, allowing him to maintain the impeccable appearance that was required. As thousands of tourists watched and photographed the elaborate ritual, James felt a confidence he had never experienced before in his uniform. David, performing his own role in the ceremony with the expertise that came from 3 years of experience, occasionally caught glimpses of James's performance. The improvement in the younger guard's confidence was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. David felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his small gesture had contributed to this success, though he would never expect or receive any formal recognition for his help. After the ceremony, as the guards were dismissed to their various duties, David made another unprecedented decision. Instead of heading directly to his assigned post, he took a slight detour that brought him past James's position. As he walked by, he allowed his pace to slow almost imperceptibly and spoke a single word under his breath. "Well done." Those 2 words, barely audible and spoken without breaking stride, had an enormous impact on James. In the formal world of the Royal Guard, where praise was rare and criticism was swift, any acknowledgement from a senior colleague was precious. But this was more than just professional recognition. It was a sign that David had been watching, had noticed the improvement, and had cared enough to offer encouragement. The rest of James's shift passed smoothly. He found himself standing straighter, feeling more confident in his role, and better able to ignore the distractions created by tourists. The simple knowledge that someone was looking out for him, that he wasn't completely alone in facing the challenges of the job, made all the difference in his performance and his attitude. As the day ended, and the guards were relieved of their duties, James realized that something had changed in his relationship with the service. The job was still demanding, the standards were still impossibly high, and the pressure was still intense. But now he understood that within this rigid system, there were people who cared about more than just following orders and maintaining appearances. David's actions had shown James that the bonds between guards could be strong without being obvious, that support could be offered without compromising professionalism, and that the brotherhood he had hoped to find in the service was real, even if it operated in ways he hadn't expected. This realization would prove to be crucial in the days ahead, as James would soon face challenges that would test not only his own resolve, but also the strength of the connections he was beginning to build with his fellow guards. 2 weeks had passed since David Thompson had first helped James Mitchell, and their subtle partnership had developed into something neither of them had expected. They had been assigned to work together several more times, and each shared duty had strengthened their unspoken understanding. But on this particular Thursday morning, their bond would face its most serious test yet. James arrived at the barracks earlier than usual, hoping to have some quiet time to prepare for what promised to be an especially demanding day. A state visit from a foreign dignitary meant heightened security, larger crowds, and increased scrutiny from commanding officers. Every guard would be expected to perform at their absolute best, with no room for even the smallest mistake. As James settled into his pre-duty routine, he noticed David sitting alone in the corner of the barracks, staring at a letter in his hands. Even from across the room, James could see that something was seriously wrong. David's usually perfect posture had slumped, and his face wore an expression of deep concern that James had never seen before. The letter trembled slightly in David's hands, suggesting that whatever news it contained had shaken him badly. David had received the letter from his sister that morning. Their father, who had been battling cancer for several months, had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The doctors didn't expect him to survive more than a few days, and the family was gathering at the hospital to say their goodbyes. David's sister was begging him to come home immediately, writing that their father kept asking for his son in the army. The timing couldn't have been worse. The state visit meant that all leave had been canceled, and every guard was required to be at their post regardless of personal circumstances. David had already spoken to his commanding officer about the situation, but the response had been exactly what he had expected. Duty came first, and personal matters would have to wait until after the official visit was completed. James watched David struggle with the letter and gradually understood that his colleague was facing an impossible choice between family loyalty and military duty. The regulations were clear. Abandoning post during a state visit could result in court-martial and dismissal from the service. But James could also see that David was being torn apart by the thought of not being with his father during his final hours. As other guards began to arrive for the morning briefing, David quickly folded the letter and attempted to compose himself. But James could see through the facade. David's hands were shaking as he adjusted his uniform, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that suggested he was fighting an internal battle that was far from over. During the briefing, the commanding officer emphasized the importance of the day's duties and the consequences of any failures. Every word seemed to weigh more heavily on David, who sat rigidly at attention while clearly struggling with his emotions. James found himself watching David more than listening to the briefing, worried about what his colleague might do. After the briefing, as the guards dispersed to their various assignments, James made a decision that surprised even himself. He approached David quietly, careful not to be overheard by any of the other guards or officers. In a whisper so soft it was barely audible, he asked, "What can I do to help?" David looked at James with surprise and gratitude, but initially insisted that nothing could be done. The rules were the rules, and there was no way around them. But James pressed gently, suggesting that perhaps there might be options that David hadn't considered. This conversation marked the first time the two guards had spoken directly about personal matters, crossing a line that most guards never dared to approach. James proposed a plan that was both simple and incredibly risky. During their afternoon shift, when they would be stationed at adjacent posts, James could gradually adjust his position to cover some of David's area of responsibility. This would allow David to step away for brief periods without leaving his post completely unguarded. It wouldn't be enough time for David to travel home, but it might allow him to make phone calls to his family and stay connected during his father's final hours. The plan required perfect timing, complete trust, and a willingness to risk both of their careers. If they were caught, both guards would face severe disciplinary action. James would be seen as abandoning his own post, and David would be guilty of dereliction of duty. But James could see that David was approaching a breaking point, and he believed that sometimes loyalty to a fellow human being had to take precedence over strict adherence to regulations. David was initially reluctant to accept the offer, knowing the risks that James would be taking on his behalf. But as the morning progressed and he received another update from his sister, indicating that their father's condition was deteriorating rapidly, his resolve began to weaken. The thought of missing his father's final moments was becoming unbearable. Finally, during a brief moment when they were alone in the equipment room, David accepted James's offer. The decision was made with few words, but with a handshake that conveyed far more than any lengthy discussion could have accomplished. They were no longer just colleagues sharing the same duties. They had become brothers in arms, willing to risk their own futures to support each other. The plan they developed was intricate and required split-second timing. James would need to expand his field of vision and patrol pattern to include portions of David's usual area. David would use hand signals to communicate when he needed to step away, and James would respond with his own signals to confirm that the area was covered. They practiced these signals subtly throughout the morning, developing a communication system that would be invisible to casual observers. As the afternoon shift approached and the crowds began to gather for the state visit, both guards felt the weight of what they were about to attempt. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential reward. For David, it meant the possibility of being connected to his family during the most difficult time of their lives. For James, it represented a chance to prove that the bonds between guards could be stronger than the regulations that governed their service. Neither of them knew how the afternoon would unfold, but they were committed to supporting each other, regardless of the consequences. Their partnership had evolved from simple professional courtesy to something approaching genuine friendship, and they were about to test just how strong that bond could be under extreme pressure. The state visit was in full swing by 3 o'clock that afternoon. and the palace grounds buzzed with activity unlike anything James Mitchell had experienced since joining the guard service. Dignitaries in expensive suits moved through carefully, choreographed ceremonies while security personnel maintained watchful positions throughout the area. Television crews captured every moment, and thousands of spectators pressed against the barriers hoping to catch a glimpse of the visiting officials. James stood at his assigned post, but his attention was divided between his official duties and monitoring David Thompson's situation 20 feet away. David had managed to maintain his composure through the morning, but James could see the strain was taking its toll. David's usually perfect posture showed subtle signs of tension, and there was a distracted quality to his movements that only someone watching closely would notice. At 3:15, David received the signal he had been dreading. A palace aide discreetly approached him with a message that had been relayed through official channels. David's sister had called the palace switchboard with an urgent update. Their father was asking for David, and the doctors believed he had only hours left. The message was delivered with professional efficiency, but James could see its devastating impact on his colleague from across the courtyard. For several minutes, David stood frozen in position, clearly struggling with the weight of the decision before him. The official ceremony was reaching its peak, with the visiting dignitary scheduled to inspect the guard in just 30 minutes. This was precisely the worst possible time for any irregularities, and David knew that any deviation from protocol would be noticed immediately by the numerous officials and officers present. James watched David's internal struggle with growing concern. He could see his colleague's composure beginning to crack under the pressure of choosing between family loyalty and military duty. David's breathing had become shallow and rapid, and there was a desperate look in his eyes that suggested he was approaching a breaking point that could have serious consequences for both of them. Then, at 3:25, David made his decision. Using the subtle hand signal they had practiced that morning, he indicated to James that he needed to step away from his post. James responded immediately with his own signal, confirming that he would provide coverage. The exchange took less than 3 seconds and was completely invisible to the hundreds of people surrounding them. James smoothly adjusted his position and expanded his field of observation to include David's area of responsibility. The movement looked natural and professional, as if he was simply making a routine adjustment to his stance. Meanwhile, David used a maintenance corridor that ran behind the main ceremonial area to reach a secure telephone that palace staff used for official business. The phone call David made was brief but emotionally devastating. His sister confirmed that their father had lost consciousness and that the family was gathering around his bedside. The doctors had indicated that death was imminent, possibly within the next hour. David's sister begged him to find some way to be there, even if only by phone during their father's final moments. While David was away from his post, James faced the most challenging few minutes of his entire career. He was responsible for monitoring nearly twice his normal area, while maintaining the appearance that everything was routine and under control. The visiting dignitary's entourage was moving closer to their section, and James knew that any security lapse during the inspection could have serious consequences for everyone involved. James's training and natural instincts served him well during this critical period. He managed to maintain awareness of both positions while appearing completely focused on his own duties. When a small child broke away from the crowd and ran toward the restricted area, James was able to signal to nearby security personnel without compromising either his own position or David's absent post. After 8 agonizing minutes, David returned to his position. His face was pale and his eyes were red, but he resumed his duties with the professionalism that had made him one of the most respected guards in the unit. James could see that the phone call had provided David with some comfort, but had also intensified his emotional struggle. Being connected to his family during this crisis was both a blessing and a torture. The inspection by the visiting dignitary proceeded without incident. Both guards performed flawlessly as the official party passed their positions, offering the crisp salutes and perfect bearing that were expected of them. To external observers, there was no indication that anything unusual had occurred, or that one of the guards was dealing with a personal crisis of enormous magnitude. But their arrangement was far from over. Throughout the afternoon, David stepped away from his post 3 more times to receive updates about his father's condition. Each time, James provided coverage without hesitation, expanding his responsibilities and accepting the additional risk. The system they had developed worked flawlessly, but the emotional toll on both guards was significant. During David's 4th call, he received the news he had been dreading. His father had passed away peacefully, surrounded by family members who had been able to say their final goodbyes. David's sister assured him that their father had known David was thinking of him and that the family understood why he couldn't be there in person. But this knowledge provided little comfort to David, who was consumed with guilt and grief. James noticed the change in David immediately when he returned from that final phone call. David's movements had become mechanical and distant, as if he was operating on autopilot while his mind processed the devastating news. James realized that his colleague was now facing an even greater challenge, completing his duties while dealing with fresh grief and overwhelming emotions. The remainder of the afternoon shift required every ounce of strength that both guards could muster. David fought to maintain his composure while mourning his father's death, and James continued to provide subtle support while managing his own demanding responsibilities. The partnership that had begun with a simple gesture of assistance had evolved into something much more profound, a bond forged through shared risk and mutual sacrifice. As the state visit ceremonies concluded and the crowds began to disperse, both guards remained at their posts until officially relieved. They had successfully navigated one of the most challenging situations either had ever faced, but the cost had been enormous. David had lost his father, and both guards had put their careers at risk in order to maintain their commitment to each other. When they were finally dismissed from duty that evening, David approached James privately for the first time since their partnership had begun. With tears in his eyes, he simply said, "Thank you." Those 2 words carried the weight of everything they had been through together, the trust, the risk, the sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond that had formed between them. James's response was equally simple. "I'm sorry for your loss." But in that moment, both guards understood that they had discovered something precious within the rigid structure of their service, the knowledge that they were not alone. The following week brought a somber atmosphere to the barracks that everyone could feel but few understood. David Thompson had been granted compassionate leave to attend his father's funeral, leaving a noticeable gap in the unit's daily operations. James Mitchell found himself assigned to different duties and partners, but his thoughts frequently returned to David and the extraordinary events of the state visit. What James didn't know was that their carefully orchestrated assistance during David's family crisis had not gone completely unnoticed. Sergeant Major William Roberts, a 30-year veteran of the Guard service, had observed subtle changes in patrol patterns and guard positioning during the state visit. His experienced eye had detected irregularities that would have been invisible to most observers, but Roberts had chosen not to investigate further at the time. Roberts had served long enough to understand that the rigid rules governing guard behavior sometimes conflicted with basic human decency. He had seen good soldiers broken by the inflexibility of military regulations, and he had learned to distinguish between genuine misconduct and the kind of solidarity that actually strengthened unit cohesion. The fact that no actual security breaches had occurred during the state visit suggested to Roberts that whatever had happened had been handled with skill and discretion. When David returned from leave, the change in him was obvious to everyone in the unit. The normally reserved but confident guard now moved with a quiet sadness that seemed to affect his entire presence. He performed his duties with the same technical precision as always, but there was a heaviness about him that spoke of grief that was still being processed. James noticed that other guards were giving David space, treating him with the respectful distance that military culture typically reserved for someone dealing with personal loss. But James also saw that this well-intentioned consideration was leaving David more isolated than ever. The very support system that had helped him through his father's final hours was now absent when he needed ongoing emotional support. On David's 3rd day back, James made a decision that would challenge the informal protocols governing relationships between guards. Instead of maintaining the usual professional distance, he approached David during a break between duties and simply asked, "How are you holding up?" The question caught David off guard. In the military environment, personal conversations were discouraged, and expressions of vulnerability were often seen as signs of weakness. But something in James's tone made it clear that this was not a casual inquiry. It was a genuine offer of support from someone who understood what David had been through. David's initial response was the standard military deflection. He was fine, focused on his duties, and ready to serve. But James persisted gently, creating a space for David to express what he was really feeling. Gradually, David began to open up about his grief, his guilt over not being present when his father died, and his struggle to find meaning in his military service when it had prevented him from fulfilling his family obligations. This conversation marked the beginning of a new phase in their relationship. What had started as professional courtesy had evolved through shared risk into something approaching genuine friendship. James became David's unofficial confidant, someone who could provide emotional support without judgment or criticism. Return. David began to share his experience and knowledge with James, helping him navigate the complex social dynamics of guard service. Their friendship did not go unnoticed by other members of the unit. Some guards viewed their close relationship with suspicion, worried that personal bonds might interfere with professional duties. Others were quietly supportive, recognizing that the military's traditional emphasis on individual strength sometimes overlooked the value of mutual support. The barracks became divided into subtle factions, with some guards distancing themselves from James and David, while others began to form their own support networks. The situation came to a head during a particularly difficult duty assignment 3 weeks after David's return. Both guards were assigned to the night watch, a rotation that required them to patrol the palace grounds during the dark hours when tourist activity was minimal, but security concerns were heightened. The isolation and reduced supervision of night duty created opportunities for more personal interaction, but it also increased the pressure on both guards to maintain perfect vigilance. During their patrol, James and David encountered a situation that would test not only their partnership, but their judgment as guards. They discovered evidence of a security breach, a section of fencing that had been damaged, possibly by someone attempting to gain unauthorized access to the palace grounds. Protocol required them to report the incident immediately and secure the area until investigators could examine the scene. But as they investigated the breach more thoroughly, they realized that the damage had been caused not by an intruder, but by a homeless man seeking shelter from a particularly cold night. The man was elderly, clearly suffering from mental illness, and posed no real security threat. However, reporting the incident would result in the man's arrest and prosecution for trespassing on royal property. James and David found themselves facing a moral dilemma similar to the one they had navigated during the state visit. The rules were clear about reporting security breaches, but their human instincts told them that destroying an old man's life over a minor incident was wrong. They had to decide whether to follow regulations strictly or to find a solution that served both security needs and human compassion. After a brief discussion, they developed a plan that satisfied both requirements. They would report the damaged fencing as routine maintenance needed rather than a security breach, and they would personally ensure that the homeless man was connected with social services rather than the criminal justice system. This approach required them to take personal responsibility for the man's future behavior and to monitor the area more closely, but it avoided criminalizing someone whose only offense was seeking warmth and shelter. The decision to handle the situation this way required complete trust between James and David. They were essentially covering for each other in a way that could have serious consequences if discovered, but they had developed enough confidence in their partnership to take the risk. Their friendship had evolved to the point where they were willing to stake their careers on their mutual judgment and reliability. Over the following weeks, their unofficial handling of the homeless man situation proved to be successful. The man was connected with appropriate services. The security issue was resolved through proper maintenance procedures, and no further incidents occurred in that area. Their creative problem-solving had achieved better results than strict adherence to regulations would have produced. But more importantly, the incident had deepened their understanding of how their partnership could serve larger purposes than just personal support. They had discovered that their bond allowed them to find solutions that balanced military requirements with human needs, creating outcomes that were better for everyone involved. Their friendship had become a tool for more effective and compassionate service rather than a distraction from their duties. 6 months after James Mitchell had first stumbled during his ceremonial duty, the dynamic between him and David Thompson had quietly transformed not just their own service experience, but the entire culture of their unit. What had begun as a simple gesture of support had evolved into something much more significant, a model for how guards could maintain their professional excellence while also supporting each other as human beings. The change became obvious during a particularly challenging week in late autumn when the palace experienced an unprecedented series of security alerts. Intelligence services had received credible threats against the royal family, requiring all guards to work extended shifts under heightened stress conditions. The demanding schedule pushed every member of the unit to their physical and emotional limits, creating exactly the kind of pressure that typically led to mistakes and disciplinary problems. But something different happened during this crisis period. Instead of the usual pattern of individual guards struggling alone with the demands of their duties, small networks of mutual support began to emerge throughout the unit. Guards who had previously maintained strict professional distance began to offer subtle assistance to their colleagues, following the model that James and David had established months earlier. Sergeant Major William Roberts observed these changes with growing interest and approval. He had been serving long enough to remember previous crises when exhausted guards had made serious errors that compromised security and damaged careers. This time, however, the unit's performance remained consistently high, despite the increased pressure. Roberts began to suspect that the unofficial support networks were actually improving operational effectiveness rather than undermining military discipline. The most dramatic example of this new culture occurred during the third night of the security alert period. Guard Michael Chen, a recent recruit who had been struggling with the demands of night duty, began to show signs of serious fatigue during his patrol. His movements became sluggish, his attention wandered, and he nearly fell asleep while standing at his post, a violation that could result in court-martial under normal circumstances. Instead of reporting Chen's condition or allowing him to fail, catastrophically, the guards in his immediate area quietly adjusted their own positions to provide additional coverage. James and David coordinated with 2 other guards to create an overlapping security pattern that allowed Chen to have brief periods of reduced responsibility while still maintaining his assigned position. The arrangement was subtle enough to avoid detection by supervising officers but effective enough to prevent any actual security lapses. This incident represented a complete evolution of the support system that had begun with David's family crisis. What had once been a desperate improvisation between 2 guards had become a sophisticated network of mutual assistance that enhanced rather than compromised the unit's effectiveness. The guards had learned to balance individual accountability with collective responsibility, creating a stronger overall security presence. The success of this approach did not escape the notice of the palace's senior security officials. Colonel Patricia Hawthorne, the commanding officer responsible for all guard units, had been receiving reports of improved performance and morale despite the challenging conditions. When she investigated the reasons for this unexpected improvement, she discovered the informal support networks that had developed throughout the unit. Rather than viewing these networks as violations of military protocol, Colonel Hawthorne recognized them as innovations that could be officially incorporated into guard training and operations. She had served in various military contexts where rigid adherence to individual responsibility had led to preventable failures, and she understood that the most effective units were often those that balanced individual excellence with team cohesion. Colonel Hawthorne arranged for James and David to meet with her privately, ostensibly to discuss their performance during the security alert period. Both guards approached the meeting with some anxiety, unsure whether their unofficial activities had been discovered and whether they would face disciplinary action. They were prepared to accept responsibility for their decisions and to protect the other guards who had followed their example. The meeting, however, took a completely unexpected direction. Colonel Hawthorne began by acknowledging that she had observed the changes in unit performance and had traced many of the improvements to the leadership that James and David had provided through their example. Rather than criticism, she offered recognition of their contributions to unit effectiveness and morale. Colonel Hawthorne explained that military leadership had been studying the effectiveness of different approaches to unit cohesion and performance. Traditional models that emphasized individual discipline and competition had proven successful in many contexts, but they sometimes failed to address the human needs that could undermine performance in high-stress environments. The approach that James and David had pioneered offered a potential solution to this long-standing challenge. The colonel proposed that James and David participate in a pilot program designed to formally incorporate peer support systems into guard training and operations. This would involve developing protocols for guards to provide assistance to their colleagues while maintaining security standards and military discipline. Their real-world experience with balancing these competing demands made them ideal candidates to help design and implement such a system. Both guards were stunned by this unexpected recognition. What they had viewed as necessary improvisation in response to personal crises was being recognized as innovative leadership that could benefit the entire guard service. The risk they had taken in supporting each other had evolved into an opportunity to influence how the military approached the balance between individual responsibility and collective support. Over the following weeks, James and David worked with Colonel Hawthorne and other senior officers to develop formal guidelines for peer support within guard units. The new protocols established clear boundaries for when and how guards could assist their colleagues without compromising security or undermining individual accountability. The system they designed preserved the essential elements of military discipline while creating space for the kind of human support that both guards had found so valuable. The pilot program was implemented first within their own unit, with James and David serving as informal mentors for other guards learning to navigate the new system. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Performance metrics improved across all categories, sick leave decreased significantly, and requests for transfers to other units dropped to almost zero. Most importantly, the unit maintained its security effectiveness while developing a reputation for high morale and strong internal cohesion. As word of the program's success spread throughout the guard service, James and David found themselves in the unexpected position of being consulted by other units seeking to implement similar approaches. Their partnership had evolved from a personal friendship into a professional collaboration that was influencing military culture at the highest levels. The most satisfying aspect of these developments was watching other guards discover the same sense of support and belonging that James and David had found in each other. Young recruits who might have struggled alone were now connected with experienced guards who could provide guidance and assistance. Veterans who had served in isolation were finding renewed purpose in mentoring and supporting their younger colleagues. 1 year after James had first stumbled during his ceremonial duty, he stood at the same post where his relationship with David had begun. But now he wore the insignia of a senior guard, and his responsibilities included training new recruits in both the technical requirements of their duties and the importance of supporting their fellow guards. David, now serving as a sergeant, had found that his personal tragedy had ultimately led to a deeper understanding of how military service could honor both duty and humanity. His father's death had taught him that life was too short and too precious to waste on unnecessary isolation and competition. The support he had received during his darkest hours had shown him the value of extending that same support to others, facing their own challenges. The transformation of their unit had attracted attention from military researchers and policymakers interested in improving effectiveness across all branches of service. The model that James and David had pioneered was being studied and adapted for use in different contexts, from basic training programs to combat units deployed overseas. As James watched the newest group of recruits begin their training, he reflected on how much had changed since his own first days in the guard service. These young guards would still face the same demanding standards and rigorous discipline that had challenged him, but they would not have to face these challenges alone. The culture of mutual support that he and David had helped to create would provide them with resources that previous generations of guards had never enjoyed. The red uniforms, the ceremonial duties, and the proud traditions remained unchanged. But beneath these visible symbols of military service, something fundamental had evolved. The guards had learned that true strength came not from individual perfection, but from collective commitment.